Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 100, The Crozier Family Scandal. Just a warning, there is some graphic information in this episode that some may find distressing. I came across a newspaper article in 1894 in Victoria outlining how a young unmarried woman had a child the police suspected had been murdered. The police commenced investigations and found the remains of an infant buried in the family's backyard. In the Mornington Standard in Victoria on the 8th of November 1894, this article outlined the coroner's inquest into the death of the infant. Today he proposed to merely take the evidence of the medical gentleman and read the statements made, and then adjourn for a week in order to give Margaret Crozier, the mother of the child, time to recover so that she might be able to be present. The jury having returned from viewing the body, the coroner called upon Constable McCaig of Frankston to give his evidence. Constable McCaig said on the 16th, Dr. Plowman, also of Frankston, reported to me the death of the child. I visited the house occupied by Robert Crozier at Skye and found the body of the child in the garden about 30 foot from the house. Previous to this, I asked the girl's mother if she knew anything about the death of the child, and she told me she knew nothing about it. She sent for the little girl, Janie Crozier, aged 13, who told me everything. She pointed out to me where the deceased child was buried in the garden, and he found the child where she described and removed it. to the police station at Frankston. I sent for Dr. Plowman, but he did not make a full examination until after the matter had been reported to the coroner. Dr. Plowman held a post-mortem examination the next day on the 17th. The coroner said, I think it is desirable to take no more evidence until the whole of the parties interested are present or are represented by a solicitor. He would now ask Dr. Plowman to give the results of his post-mortem examination. Dr. Sidney Plowman stepped forward. The coroner said, it was reported to me that you attended the mother of the deceased child, but I only want to know of your examination you made on the 17th. Dr. Plowman sworn and stated that he was a duly qualified surgeon residing in Frankston. He'd made a post-mortem examination commencing on the 17th of November 1891 on the body of a female child handed to him by Constable McCaig, in his presence dictated notes to him. The body was covered with earth and a torn, discoloured rag was with it. Indications of decomposition were not extremely marked. No signs of violence were on the trunk, limbs or neck. The body apparently was well developed and measured about 21 inches from crown of head to sole of foot. The cranial cavity was opened by a wound extending from just above one ear across the brow to behind the other ear. No sign of brain matter visible. The bones of the skull were shattered and some fragments were lying loose in the skull. One eye was exposed, breaking off at the roof of the orbit. There was a large bruise about 3 inches in diameter on the right side of the back of the head. This was not due to post-mortem staining. From a number of observations, he concluded that the child had breathed, and when pressed by the coroner, thought it was probable that the child lived more than some seconds, but possibly not an hour. It might have cried. He had examined every organ of the body, and the appearance of them all were consistent with those of a child that was properly developed, delivered at full term, and had breathed for some time, and he had no doubt that the injuries to the head had caused death. The coroner asked, you mentioned that the cord of the navel string was 3 inches. Was it cut, not tied? And Dr. Plowman said it was torn. The coroner asked, in your opinion, what was the cause of death? Dr. Plowman said the wounds on the head, that is, fracture of the skull and laceration of the brain. The coroner asked, the burial of the body of the child had preserved the lungs of the child rather than otherwise? You are perfectly satisfied that the lungs had been inflated and that the child might have lived and cried? And the response was yes. A juryman asked, what is the shortest time it would take for the lungs to be fully inflated? And Dr. Plowman said, authorities differ. I think in ordinary cases within 24 hours. Some infants when born gasp and others when born breathed and cry very lustily. The expansion of the lungs in the latter were much more rapid than the former. And the juryman asked, was the cause of death almost instantaneous? And he said yes. You are not in a position at present moment to decide on the actual cause of death. And he said no. Are there any other obvious causes which might have caused death? And he said no. Is it your opinion that these injuries caused the child's death? And he said it is quite possible that they may have been caused after the child's death. It is possible that it may have come to its death in some other way. It may have been suffocated. You saw no other cause? No. If the navel string had been torn, it would not bleed. It is just possible that the child may have been suffocated. Is that your opinion? No. What is your opinion as to the cause of the death? I wish to have your opinion. And he said, I cannot give a positive opinion. The foreman asked, would there be a possibility of the child being born alive and those present not knowing it? And he said, no. Are you satisfied the child was alive? Yes, the child was born alive, and would go a little further to say that the lungs were well distended. John Walsh, the Inspector of Police, sworn, I went in company with Dr. Sergeant Nixon and Constable McCaig to the house of Robert Crozier, a small farmer and labourer living at Skye in the parish of Langwarrin. I saw Robert Crozier, his wife and daughters, Janet and Jane Crozier, the latter aged 13 years, and I took a statement in writing from Mrs. Crozier, no other member of the family being present in the room at the time. I cautioned her very carefully and told her that the statement should be taken down and most likely be used in evidence against her. She stated that on the day the child was born, she left her home at 11 o'clock in the morning, accompanied by her daughter, Janet Crozier, and that the child was born in the afternoon. On her return, she said that she saw Janie, her youngest daughter, and told her Margaret was in bed. She did not ask what was the matter with Margaret, as she had been complaining of a headache in the morning. She did not even suspect anything. She said Janet told her that Margaret had a baby and it was dead. She then said that she asked Janie if she'd buried the baby, and she told her yes. I asked the mother if her daughter told her who was the father of the child, and she said that she had named one, but she could not believe it. I asked her to name this one, and she told me that Margaret had told her that Hugh Taylor, her brother-in-law, was the father of the child. She said she had accused Margaret of several men, but she said that Taylor was the father. I then called Janet Crozier into the room, and I cautioned her in the usual way very carefully. She said she did not know that her sister was with child until the birth, but altered this statement afterwards. When she and Janet got up on Wednesday, Margaret was groaning. Then she said that she and her mother knew that Margaret was going to have a baby. We gave her some aconite, and my mother and sister went away about 11 o'clock. She also said that when the child was born, she and Janet were in the room. Then she broke down and said that she would tell everything. She told me that they all knew about it and that it had been arranged about a month before the birth to kill the baby. She said they all know that Taylor was the father. She was out in the kitchen when she heard a baby cry 3 times, and she went into Margaret's room and saw her mother sitting on Margaret's bed with a baby in her arms. Her mother then told Janet to take it away and kill it. She took the baby in her arms and laid it on the ground and got a spade and cut its head open. She then went into Margaret's room, and her mother asked her if she'd killed it, and she told her yes. She then told her to dig a hole and bury it. She then lifted the baby up, and as she did so, some of the brains dropped out and the fowls ate them. I told my father on the Saturday that I'd killed it, but he did not say anything. At this stage, Mrs. Crozier and her 2 daughters, Janet and Jane, were brought up and formally remanded to Melbourne Jail until the next Thursday. Margaret is at present in the hospital. Janie, the daughter who killed the child, does not seem to realise the awful position in which she is placed. So 11 days later, it's reported on the 19th of November in the Melbourne Age. Alleged infanticide at Frankston. Margaret Crozier charged with murder. An important development took place in the alleged infanticide case at Frankston on Saturday when Dr. Plowman reported to the police that the result of the post-mortem examination, which he had made on the body of the child found buried in Crozier's front garden, justified him in forming the opinion the child had been born alive. Acting upon this, Mounted Constable McCaig, who was in charge of the case, obtained a warrant for the arrest of Margaret Crozier on the charge of murder. McCaig at once proceeded to Skye, where Margaret Crozier resides with her parents, and arrested her. She was in bed when the constable arrived, but was dressed and brought into Frankston. Later on, the accused was brought before Mr. W.H. O'Grady, JP, and charged that she did, on or about the 8th of November, wilfully murder her female child. No evidence was taken, and the girl, being remanded for a week, was conveyed by train to Melbourne and lodged in the Melbourne jail. Owing to her weak condition, she was admitted to the jail hospital, where she will be detained until she has sufficiently recovered to undergo the ordeal of a police court trial. And another article in the Melbourne Argus at this time, titled "A Strange Case Near Frankston, Margaret Crozier Arrested, Charged with Child Murder." It was reported to the police that the girl Margaret Crozier had given birth to a child, and that the disposal of this child or of its body appeared to be involved in peculiar circumstances. He gave information which had been in his possession for a day or two, but which he had withheld for prudent reasons. When Dr. Plowman attended the girl, she was extremely ill, and when he learned, partly by professional diagnosis and partly from what members of the family told him, that the circumstances of the birth and disposition of the body of the child were peculiar, and he, as a matter of duty, determined to communicate with the police. But he had to delay a little because any excitement such as would naturally follow upon a police investigation might have been fatal to his patient. When sufficient progress had been made towards the convalescence, the report was made and steps already recorded were taken. The younger sister of the girl Margaret averred that the injury to the head was due to accidental dropping of the spade when the body was being buried, and both the girls were strong in their assurance that the child was stillborn. Mr. Plowman's examination was not completed Saturday, but as far as it went appeared indicated that the child was born alive and well developed. The jury committed Janet Crozier for murder and her mother and two sisters as accessory before the fact. Hugh Taylor denies that he's the father of the child. And then it mentions that the girl Crozier, located in hospital at the Melbourne jail, is progressing well and will probably be strong enough to attend the police court on the 22nd of November. So on the 7th of December 1894, the Crozier infanticide cases, Janet Crozier committed for trial. Another article on the 22nd of November says, "A terrible story, family scandal." In Melbourne, the Frankston child murder case has now assumed ghastly proportions. On Sunday, Margaret Crozier, daughter of a settler living beyond Frankston, was arrested of child murder. She states that Hugh Taylor, her brother-in-law, was the father of the child, and her mother and sisters agreed that the child, once born, would be killed to prevent scandal. The mother, Mrs. Crozier, denies the statement that she told her children to take it out and kill it. She said she was away from home when the child was born. Mrs. Crozier and Janet Crozier, another daughter, were present at the confinement. The statement made by Jane Crozier runs as follows. "I was 13 years old last January. My sister Janet came home from Cranbourne on Monday, and she and I and Margaret slept in the same bed. On Wednesday morning early, Margaret became very ill, and at 7 o'clock a child was born. We had all known of Margaret's condition for some months. When mother or father mentioned it, Margaret only laughed. She had blamed Hugh Taylor, who lived in the house with us, and the father turned him out. Father usually went away on a Monday and did not come home until Saturday. He was away when the child was born, but mother and Janet were in the room with Margaret, and I was outside in the kitchen. I heard a baby crying several times, and then I went into the room. Margaret was in bed covered up, and mother was sitting on the bed with the baby in her arms. It was naked and crying. Janet was standing looking on. Mother said to me, 'Take it away and kill it,' and at the same time she handed the baby to me. I took it out into the garden and laid it on the ground. It was then alive and crying. I got a spade and hit the baby on the head with it twice. I chopped it straight down and killed it. Some of the brains fell out and the fowls gathered around and ate them. Having killed the child, I went back into Margaret's bedroom and said to mother, 'I have killed it with the spade.' She told me to dig a hole and bury the body, and I did so. Later she said, 'Have you buried it deep enough?' And I answered yes. Mother and Janet went away to my sister's place. I think Janet went there because she wanted to get away from our place and had no other place but Taylor's to go to. It was arranged amongst us that we should kill the baby as soon as it's born so that no one should know anything about it. That was about a month before it was born. It was I who suggested that we should kill it. Mother and Margaret were present and agreed to it. When Father came home on Saturday the 10th, Margaret was in bed sick. He asked me what had been done with the child. I told him I had buried it. He did not ask whether it had been born alive, and I did not tell him. This afternoon, the police took into custody Janet Crozier, aged 18, and charged her with complicity in the shocking affair. In the Portland Guardian on the 28th of December 1894. The trial of 4 females, Jane Victoria Crozier, Janet Crozier Sr., Janet Christina Crozier and Margaret Ann Crozier for the murder of an infant at Skye near Frankston, was concluded in the criminal court on Thursday. The case for the Crown was on the 7th of November last. Margaret Crozier gave birth to an illegitimate child, which at the instance of Margaret's mother, Janet Crozier Sr., was at once taken into the yard by Jane Victoria Crozier, chopped about the forehead with a spade and subsequently buried in a hole, which she dug for its reception. Soon after the murder, Jane Victoria Crozier made a statement in which she practically acknowledged the part she had in the transaction. Margaret and Janet Christina Crozier were in the room when the mother directed the youngest sister, Jane Victoria Crozier, to take the child out in order to kill and bury it. The statement made by the young girl was, however, subsequently varied, as she stated the death was due to the spade accidentally falling on the infant. At the conclusion of the evidence for the Crown, His Honour directed the jury to acquit the 3 elder prisoners, as the statement made by Jane Victoria Crozier could not be used as evidence against them, and there was not sufficient evidence to justify him in sending the case to the jury. These 3 prisoners were therefore discharged, and the jury, after deliberating for some time, found the 4th prisoner, Jane Victoria Crozier, not guilty, and she was also discharged. So a little bit of the family. Well, the parents, as mentioned, was Robert Crozier, the father. He was born on the 25th of May 1844 at Moonee Ponds, Victoria. His parents were Irish, Thomas Crozier and Jane Allen, who had emigrated to Victoria in around 1840. Robert married Janet Syme on the 19th of September 1872 at Spring Hill, Langwarrin, Victoria. Janet was Scottish, who had immigrated to Australia with her parents and siblings. On the 9th of July 1904, it was presented in the papers that an elderly man named Robert Crozier, aged 60, with an ample beard of artificial blackness, was defendant at the City Court in the case of an attempted assault on a little girl of 13, named Nellie Hanson. The child's story was to the effect that on the 2nd of July, Crozier met her in the Eastern Market and, after showing her some of the sights of the city, took her to the Treasury Gardens where the offence was committed. The bench, after hearing evidence, committed the accused to trial. He was locked up in the Little Burke Street watch house and will appear in the City Court tomorrow. On the 21st of July, it was reported that in the case of Robert Crozier, charged with an assault on a 13-year-old girl in Treasury Gardens on the 2nd of July, with respect to whom a jury was unable to agree on Friday, and a null prosequi has been entered. So in other words, he was acquitted. It does arise questions, though, as to whether this infant child was actually the result of not her brother-in-law being the father, but was it her father? An article referring to Robert Crozier, another lunatic. On Saturday last, a Mrs. Crozier residing at Moonee Ponds applied to His Worship the Mayor under the following distressing circumstances. Her husband, who's known to be a steady and industrious man, had within the last few weeks been affected with loss of reason. He described himself to her as suffering from extreme dizziness in the head, which incapacitated him from pursuing his usual avocations, and while suffering in the manner above described, he had several times attempted to cut her throat with a clasped knife, which he was in the habit of carrying about with him. Not coming home at the usual hour on the previous night, she went in search and found him sitting by the side of a waterhole without any apparent purpose. Mrs. Crozier seems deeply affected at being compelled to adopt the course she had, and said she would not have done so had her circumstances in life been such as to enable her to employ a keeper for her husband. The unfortunate man being present, the Mayor, as a precautionary step, ordered him into custody and to be remanded to a future day for the purpose of procuring the opinion of a medical man into his mental state. And there was a memorial in the paper. It says, "In loving remembrance of my dear husband and our dear father, Robert Crozier, who departed this life on the 20th of October 1906 at his residence, Bellato Road, Skye." And then Janet passed away on the 14th of July 1916 at Melbourne Hospital. The dearly loved mother of Agnes, Margaret, Janet, James, Jane, Joseph, Robert, Samuel, William and John, in her 70th year, a colonist of 64 years. So a little more on the children. The eldest was Agnes Jane, known as Jane, and she was born in 1873 in Cranbourne. Agnes married Ewan Taylor in Victoria in 1893. They had 4 children, and Ewan Taylor is the brother-in-law that is mentioned in the court records. And there's a notice on Jane's death. The late Mrs. A.J. Taylor was a Lyndhurst South girl. The late Mrs. Agnes Jane Taylor of O'Shea Road, Berwick, whose death occurred on September the 17th, a few brief hours after she suffered a stroke, was born at Lyndhurst South, the daughter of the late Mr. and Mrs. Robert Crozier. Aged 78 when the end came, she was the widow of the late Mr. Hughie Taylor and is survived by one son, Ewan, and one daughter, Eva. Their loss is indeed a sad one, and their sorrow is shared by many district friends in the Cranbourne and Berwick area, where their mother had resided all her life. And that was in September 1950. The second child, Margaret, the basis of the article, she was born in Cranbourne in 1875, and as we know, she gave birth to a daughter on the 7th of November 1894, where it was alleged that Hugh, or Ewan Taylor, her brother-in-law, was the father of the child. The births, deaths and marriage records in Victoria also have another child that's recorded as being born in 1899 to Margaret and dying in 1900. Margaret married Thomas Stafford in 1909 in Victoria, and they had a son, Robert Henry Stafford, that was born at Cranbourne in 1910, and Margaret died in Kew on the 31st of May 1953, aged 78. And a memorial was placed in the paper. It says, in memory of Margaret Ann Stafford, who passed away on the 31st of May 1953, loving mother of Jim, mother-in-law of Peggy, grandmother of Len, Pauline, Robert, Rosemary and Jeff, sister to Jen, Mrs. Griffin and Jack Crozier. The third child was Janet Christina, and she was born in Cranbourne in 1876. She married William John Joseph Griffin in 1899, and they had 2 sons. Her husband died in 1906 when their youngest child was only 5, and Janet lived until she was 92 and died at Dingley, Victoria in August 1968. The fourth child, James Thomas Crozier, was born at Lyndhurst, Victoria in 1879. He married Mary Amelia MacDonald in 1905, and they had 4 children. James died in July 1952 in Windsor, Victoria, aged 73, at his home at 44 Cholmondeley Street. And it stated that their children were Florence, Reen, Ivy and Jess. Jane Victoria, the next child, was born in Cranbourne in 1881, and she died on the 17th of May 1920, aged only 40. The sixth child, Joseph John, was born in 1883 in Cranbourne, and he died on the 31st of May 1946 at the age of 63, and he did not marry or have any children. And his will states, Joseph John Crozier, late of South Lyndhurst, retired farmer. The benefactors of his will were James Thomas Crozier and John Alexander Crozier. The seventh child was Robert George Crozier, and he was born at Lyndhurst in 1885. He enlisted under the name George Hope in 1915 and embarked aboard the Ascanius to the Suez Canal, arriving in December 1915. He was wounded in action in December 1916 in France. He was sent back to Australia on the 20th of March 1918. He accidentally fell overboard from the HMHS Wandilla while at sea, missing and believed drowned. And there was an article that states, will in assumed name. Having enlisted under the name of George Hope, Robert George Crozier, farmer, late of Lyndhurst, made a will in which he signed with his assumed name. Crozier was killed whilst on active service, and some difficulty was experienced in proving his will, which eventually came into the possession of his brother, John Alexander Crozier, farmer of Lyndhurst South. By means of photographs, a letter written by Crozier to a schoolboy, and with the aid of a handwriting expert, who declared that the signatures on the letter and on the will were made by the same person, John Alexander Crozier satisfied Mr. Justice Hood this morning that he should be granted administration of his deceased brother's estate. The estate comprised of £240. The eighth child, Samuel Henry Crozier, was born in 1886 at Lyndhurst. He died aged 47 in 1933, and there was an article outlining his death. Through the death of Mr. Samuel Crozier, the Cranbourne Shire has lost one of its best known residents. Sam, as he was familiarly or affectionately called, from one end of the Shire to the other, was for many years employed by the Cranbourne Shire Council on roadwork and bridges. Of a steady, hard-working and ambitious disposition, he resigned his job and entered into dairy farming at Clyde. Some years later, when a reshuffle took place in the Cranbourne Shire, it was decided to appoint a foreman. Sam was asked to make an application and was appointed to the position. He held this position for some years, and upon his resignation, the councillors presented him with a gold watch, suitably inscribed, and the workmen presented him with a gold chain. There is not the slightest doubt that the sterling service he gave to the Shire was the start of the illness which caused his death. Sam for some time rode a push bike and later a motorbike all over the Shire, from Dandenong to Langwarrin to Heath Hill and the Gerties, and this went on daily. He had a large staff of men and he kept them all working. He knew how long it would take to do a certain job, and the job had to be done properly. The ratepayers will never realise how much he saved the Shire in hard cash. He knew where and how to obtain the best results with the ratepayers' money. He was an abstainer and one of the strictest integrity. He was often offered new hats and bottles of whiskey, but Sam always said he could pay for his own things. Many of the residents throughout the Shire will miss his thoughtful and generous nature. Unostentatiously, he would send along gifts as to cause no embarrassment to the recipient, and there are a greater number of these than the average person is aware. It was an honour to be included in his friendships. He did not have the veneer and polish that is sometimes taken for a gentleman, but he was a natural gentleman. Discerning and far-sighted, and with an apt ability to illustrate his point with an anecdote taken from a wealth of practical experience. The world is poorer in his passing, but the better for his having lived here. The ninth child, William Arthur Crozier, was born in 1888 in Cranbourne. He married Minnie Norwood in 1917, and he died on the 11th of January 1922 at the age of only 34. And in the Eltham and Whittlesea Shires Advertiser and Diamond Creek Valley Advocate on the 20th of January 1922, it says that on Wednesday the 11th at A.P. Leonard's sawmill at Toolangi, a man named William Crozier of Lyndhurst was assisting to haul a log to the mill. In passing over another log, the dogs became adrift and the log rolled over Crozier. His head and body were crushed and he died in half an hour. He leaves a wife and 2 children. After hearing the evidence, it was returned a verdict of accidental death with no blame attached to anyone. And the 10th child, John Alexander Crozier, was born in 1891 in Cranbourne, and he died on the 25th of April 1961 at the age of 71. So quite a shocking and scandalous event that took place in that family. However, they seemed to pick themselves up and generally move on with life, and most of the children went on to marry and have children of their own.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.